I'm Dr. Richard Shumack from the Arthur Jeffrey Center for the Study of Islam, and I would like to welcome you to this very first Arthur Jeffrey Center podcast. We're very privileged today to have Dr. Mark Jury, who is with us at the center, and we're going to be talking about an issue that's particularly current and particularly serious and important, and that is the place of Hamas in the current conflict in Israel and Palestine. So, first of all, Mark, welcome to this podcast, this very first podcast. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, great to be talking with you, Richard, and such an important subject too.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we kick it off, and can I just ask you what or who is Hamas?
Yeah, I think for many people, particularly in Western countries, the idea, even the idea of Hamas, what its purposes are, what it's trying to achieve is difficult to grasp. But Hamas is an offshoot of a very influential Islamic organization called the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded decades ago in the earlier part of the 20th century. But Hamas itself was founded in 1988. Its name is an acronym for, in Arabic, a phrase that means Islamic resistance movement. And the word Hamas itself means zeal or enthusiasm. Interestingly, in Hebrew, it also has a meaning. It means wickedness or destruction or violence. So that's quite a name. And Hamas is one of the two parties in power amongst Palestinians. The other is Fatah, whose name's also an acronym with the meaning of conquest. And there's two Palestinian territories. They're divided into two. Hamas rules in Gaza and Fatah rules in the West Bank. So Hamas took power in Gaza in 2006 after it won a democratic election. If I'm not mistaken, that was the last democratic election. And at the time, there was a lot of conflict between Hamas and Fatah. So that's Hamas. It's a radical Islamic movement. And it has an uneasy relationship with Fatah, but Fatah praised Hamas for the October the 7th attacks. And there's a lot of support for Hamas across the Middle East at the present time.
Right. And you mentioned that Hamas sort of grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Can you give us a bit of a sense of who the Muslim Brotherhood is and how that feeds into the thinking of Hamas?
Yeah, so the Muslim world has been in a kind of long, slow, intense crisis since around about 1500. And the crisis has been caused by the advance of Europe, of Christendom in a sense, from the Muslim perspective, and the relative decline of Islam. So basically European powers and Russia as well were winning on multiple fronts against the Muslim world for centuries. And out of those losses and the loss of India, for example, and other countries too, you got a sense of crisis. And the crisis was Islam teaches that Muslims should be victorious. They should be conquerors. And if Islam's failing and it's being beaten on all fronts, then what's going wrong? There must be a reason, a theological reason. It's a theological crisis. It's like a macro version of the personal crisis when something bad happens to somebody and it's like, where is God? Why has God permitted this to happen to me? So the Islamic world has asked this question, why are we declining in the face of the advance of Europe? And the answer was, we need to be stricter in following Islam. We need to have an Islamic revival, a renewal of Islam. And a whole lot of movements were formed out of that theological idea, that there was a way forward by restoring Islam. And the Muslim Brotherhood was one of those movements. It was founded in Egypt in 1928. And its ultimate goal, because it's an Islamic renewal movement, is to establish a caliphate, that is an overarching state ruled by Islamic law, which includes the whole Muslim world. And this movement is particularly interesting because it has a network of supporters across many, many countries, including the United States and across Europe. And Hamas is still connected to the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood came out of Egypt. It's interesting. Gaza was under Egypt for a while after 1948. So the Brotherhood had quite deep roots into Gaza. And I think that's why Hamas has been so successful in Gaza.
Yeah, so help us. Terms I think are really important, and particularly the self-understanding of movements like Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. So people use the term Islamist and Jihadi to describe Hamas. Can you tease out for us a bit what those terms mean? How is an Islamist different from a Muslim? Are they like, how do those two terms relate? Where does jihadist fit in as well? Are Islamists jihadists? Give us a bit of terminology.
Yeah, well, the problem is that amongst sort of terrorist movements in the world that are dangerous and cause trauma, Islam is massively overrepresented. A very large proportion of the very traumatic events that are happening, attacks on civilians in many countries, across Africa, into Southeast Asia, in the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia as well, and Europe too. Islam is overrepresented. And after 9/11, this became really acute. And the problem was, how can we speak about this? How can we talk about the Islamic character of these movements without tarring all Muslims with the same brush, without implying that every Muslim is a threat? You need language for it. So it's Islamic, but you don't want to say it's Islamic because, that would imply that you start worrying about your Muslim neighbor. So that the solution that's emerged, and it's become kind of entrenched now, is to use the word Islamist. So the word Islamist is a form of Islam which is dedicated to achieving political dominance for Islam. So an Islamist movement is determined to form an Islamic state in which Sharia law is the law of the land. This can be applied to many Islamic revival movements. And in a way, theoretically, every Muslim should be committed to Islamic law, to Sharia, because it's a foundational part of Islam. But this term Islamist is particularly used for the movements that are willing to use violence now to achieve a political goal of establishing an Islamic state. So that's a way of dealing with that. Why do you think, Richard, that what do you think about this motivation to somehow talk about the Islamic character of these movements, but not to tar all Muslims with the same brush? Do you think that's working in our culture today? What are people making of that?
Yeah, well, is it working? It's certainly what has worked, I think, is, and you see this in political discourse, particularly in the media, certainly in public political discourse and the media, is you have a perception that what we're calling Islamism, and I agree with you, by the way, that Islamist is used in terms of people who want to see either an Islamic state, or another way of putting it, they want Islam to be in charge, to rule the government, but all the way down to rule every element of life, including government. I think that is Islamist. And I think that there is a public perception that ordinary Muslims don't want that, and it's just the radicals who do want that. Radical is another term, radical Islamist. And I think there's been a success by those who want to separate out Islamism or radical Islam from ordinary Islam. That's been a successful move. I don't think it's an accurate description of the Muslim world, but certainly for those who want to say that, as you said before, want ordinary Muslims not to be tarred with the brush of being a terrorist, that's been the shift. I don't think it fits the Muslim self-imagination either, but that's been the political move or the media move in the West.
Which term do you prefer? Some people speak about radicals, and some speak about extremists, Islamists. What do you think is a good way forward to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I think for a start, one of the ironies, and it's been a trend for many years, is for people in the West to sort of describe Islam on Western terms, not Muslim terms. And we need to understand Islamists on their terms, groups like Hamas, and understand how the terms that they use to describe themselves. And so I think, for a start, that it's really helpful to understand that a jihad is a Muslim term, and it's a particular approach to implementing Islam. And you said it before, every Muslim should, if at least a traditional understanding of Islam, should want Islam to be pervasive across all of society. I think the difference comes on how that might happen. And what a jihadist will say is you can use force and violence and military force and aggressive military force to achieve that end. You can implement Islam by force. Actually, very few Muslims are, how would I put it, actively pursuing that, but the studies would show that at least a quarter of Muslims worldwide would be supportive of that, even though only a few percent would sort of actively pursue that. Probably a quarter of Muslims are Islamist in the term of sort of proactively desiring Islam to be in charge. Many would want to see that happen through, how would I put it, peaceful means or political means. You'd get them elected rather than enforced. But jihadi movements are certainly at the theologically energetic end of things, and movements like ISIS, movements like Al-Qaeda, they're jihadi movements, and I think Hamas is absolutely a jihadi movement. Also, another term that's really helpful to understand, which is another self-describing term, is Salafi. And so the Salafs were the companions or the early Muslim community, and a Salafi Muslim will say not only should we enforce Islam, but it should look like the early days of Islam. It should look like what Islam was like when Muhammad and his first companions were around. And so that form of Islam absolutely rejects modernism or things like democracy or a whole range of ways that we would do things in the West. And so again, Hamas and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're all examples of, broadly speaking, those sort of movements who are Salafi and are jihadi. And I think they're really helpful terms to use particularly. And that's absolutely Hamas.
So what do you think about the term terrorist? Is that helpful or is it sort of confusing?
Well, I think you can use it in a sloppy, confusing way. I think if we're going to use it properly, we need to say there are certain acts that are, to use it in its technical sense, there are certain acts that are outside what we would call war, or they're not soldiers fighting soldiers. They're deliberate acts that are designed to strike terror into innocent people. They're unprovoked. They're outside the bounds of what we would consider ordinary warfare. And so I think terrorism is a real term. And I do think groups like, so what you saw with Hamas in its unprovoked attack, particularly its treatment of children, infants, and the manner of the brutality that it executed that, they were absolutely would qualify as acts of terror. So you wouldn't want to say that every jihadi activity was terrorism, but certainly they are engaged in terror, and terror is seen in the Quran as a legitimate tactic.
So terror is a mean sort of way in which the jihad can be pursued.
Yeah, it's one of them. But to reduce jihadi to terrorism, I think, is a mistake. But certainly it's seen as a legitimate tool by a range of jihadi Muslims.
So what is this? I think jihad, I've heard means struggle, but what does it? What is the struggle for? What is Islam, the religion, grounded in? What does it come from? Yeah,
you're correct. Like the word itself, the root of the word is to do with struggle. And there's been a concerted campaign, I think, by Western Muslims to try and explain that as the internal struggle to be a good Muslim against. So Islam doesn't have a strong sense of humans being unavoidably sinful or anything like that, but they do think that humans are weak and humans are forgetful, and so it's the struggle to stay on that straight path of Islam. And that is certainly true. That's one of the senses of the term jihad. But historically, and again, going back to the early days of Muhammad, jihad absolutely included the external formal military struggle to enforce Islam at every level of society. Islam there's not that, we talk in the West about a church-state separation. There's no hint of that in Islam. The struggle is to implement, enforce Islam at every level of society, the personal, the family, the community, government, military, justice. And so jihad is all those levels and absolutely includes military and the military enforcement of Islam.
So where does all this go back to? Like the rules, the Sharia, the way of life, what's it grounded in terms of the history of all this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Where does all this come from? Because, again, it taps into this question of who are the real Muslims? And we've got the violent Muslims, whatever we want to call them, and then there are the ordinary peaceful Muslims. But seems to me, and this is not just me, I think this would be a general understanding in the Muslim world, is that the heart of Islam, or the definition of what it is to be Islamic or a Muslim, the heart of Islam is the Quran, its scriptures, and the Sunnah, which is the example and the sayings, the teachings, the rulings of Muhammad. And so fundamentally, you are accepting what the Quran teaches about God, but even more than that, you're seeing Muhammad as the greatest example of what it is to be a religious person. He's the model for what it is to be a faithful Muslim.
So would you say that a group like Hamas is very reverential and desiring to follow those basic principles that you've described?
Absolutely. And in fact, again, I use that term Salafi. I think you can make a good case that both in the attitudes, the theology, and the behaviors as well of groups like Hamas, they are modeling themselves very closely on what the early Muslim community, even when it was led by Muhammad, undertook, particularly in terms of the use of the military and the tactics that were involved and the extreme measures that were taken. That's pretty clear in the history of Islam.
Yeah, that's somewhat disturbing to think about that. Sometimes when Western people speak of religion, they think of it as something individual, personal, interior, even spiritual. Can Islam be like that for people?
Oh, certainly it can. There are many Western Muslims. There's a range of people who would call themselves Muslims. There are a number of them who would want to try and have some sort of separation between the public and the private. There are particular movements, a range of people might have heard of Sufism, which is like the mystical practices involved in Islam. There are a number of Sufis who would like to see Islam in very different terms, particularly in a very direct, intimate, personal, spiritual experience of God. Others are quite liberal in the way they read things. They want to be modernist. They want to foot in both camps. They want to live in the modern world and want to have a sort of a private faith. But I don't think any of those are the original Islam or the traditional Islam. And most traditional Muslims would view things like Sufism and modernism as aberrations, not as the heart of Islam.
What do we observe when we look at Muslim countries is that often political parties in Islamic states or countries that have a majority of Muslims have a very strong orientation towards religion, the religious parties, basically. I mean, there have been exceptions like the Ba'ath Party in Iraq and Syria, which was a more secular vision, but those parties have kind of declined, and everywhere in Islamic jurisdictions, the parties are very religious. What is that? What is it about Islam that causes it to be such an inspirational driver of political parties and political processes?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And it also relates to what you were talking about before about the rise of what we call the transnational Islamist movements. Again, Muslim Brotherhood's a key one, but Al-Qaeda is another version. And I think we're at the root, it is that Islam fundamentally is about law. This is sort of the mindset that drives what you're talking about. Islam fundamental. God doesn't reveal himself in a personal way in Islam. What he does is he reveals laws, and what you do with laws is that you implement them, you enforce them. And these laws are for every part of society, the personal and the public and the political and the military. And so it's right in the sort of DNA of Islam is that it can be, and if you're an Islamist, should be enforced on people. And so that, putting it slightly differently, and my recently deceased or passed away friend, Shabar Akhtar, who's a political theologian within Islam, he's written a great book called, I say great in the sense of it explains this really clearly. It's called Islam as a Political Religion. He would argue that Islam is inherently, necessarily political for just that reason. It's laws that you impose on people, and if you're going to do it properly for people's good, that's what you do. And so the rise of people who really care about it are going to be in a political sense.
There's a verse in the Quran which says that Muslims are the best people that have been raised up by Allah for humankind. And then it goes on to say they're the ones that command what's right and forbid what's wrong. And you can only do that if you have power, political power. But some critics of Islam then say that it's not a religion at all. It's just a political system. I've heard that a lot from many Western people. And I think they're kind of resentful that Islam is being given a free pass as a religion when, at least for some Muslims, it's a very political vision that's being pursued. So what do you make of that claim that Islam's not a religion?
It's making the same problem as the people who say that it's not violent. Like it's creating this sort of separation that doesn't exist in the ordinary traditional Muslim view of what a religion is. A religion is total, all of life, and it's an ideology that is totalitarian in that it speaks to every element. And so of course it's political, and of course it's personal, and of course it's all those things. And in the Muslim imagination, certainly the keen, committed Muslim imagination, all those things are just false separations.
It's interesting. It's, you have to think of things differently, don't you? It's a different world, different cultural traditions. And we're all shaped by these traditions in deep ways which we don't fully understand.
It's a different religious imagination. It's a different way of thinking about who God is, how he operates in the world, what religion, even foundationally, what is a religion is thought about differently. And it's lazy and sloppy. And again, I talked earlier about the media's use of terms. I think most people in the public media don't understand that, aren't even really interested, don't have the categories to understand it.
Well, let's bring this back to...
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, we've sort of veered off a bit. Let's bring it back to Hamas again. And just maybe to bring us to a close, let's focus in on exactly what is it, given these, we've sort of set the scene, the big picture scene for what Islamists generally go for. What is Hamas particularly aiming for?
Well, as it happens, they have a charter which was adopted in 1988. And I think it's still valid. They've updated it a bit, but it's basically, still the same. It's known as the Hamas Charter. And it's very clear in that document, which is like their constitution, that their goal is to implement Islam fully and strictly. Now, you might have thought the goal of Hamas is to destroy Israel and to establish a Palestinian state. That's part of it, but it's a sub-goal. The big goal is to impose Islam. So the Charter says Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our example, the Quran is our constitution, Jihad is our path, and death for the sake of Allah is the loftiest of our wishes. So it's about Islam. And the Charter also says that they want to destroy Israel. They quote the words of the founder of the Brotherhood. There's another connection to the Muslim Brotherhood, which says that Hassan al-Banna said, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it. So there's a very strong conviction that that's going to happen. It's like a sacred calling. And the Charter has many verses from the Quran that speak of warfare against disbelievers. But the goal of destroying Israel is but a stepping stone to the overarching goal of the full restoration and implementation of Islam. And that's why occasionally Hamas preachers say, we're not going to stop here. we will conquer Rome, we will conquer America. Occasionally you hear them say, we have a much bigger vision than just this immediate struggle.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned the charter. I think that's helpful too, because in a sense, I wouldn't recommend anyone just listen to us about this, but the charter is freely available if you want to go and see the 1988 charter that describes all the sort of Islamist, jihadi, Salafi, the terms that we've been using. You'll find that sort of Islam absolutely described in that charter. I'm wondering, Mark, too, we've seen in very recent days attempts at ceasefires, negotiations, particularly you've got Qatar coming in and trying to be some sort of peace broker. And you've certainly had many, many years of hopes for things like two-state solutions where we can come to the table and have a peace accord. And what do you think the charter of Hamas says, or how does it speak into prospects for negotiated peace?
Yeah, so the charter has this very interesting statement that land that's once been conquered by Islam belongs to the Muslim community forever. It's like their personal inheritance. And in that mindset, Muslims have to be in charge if a land has once been conquered. Non-Muslims cannot rule. So that's a fundamental thing that has to change. And they are very committed to a one-state solution. The Hamas government says, and I quote, "So-called peaceful solutions and international conferences are in contradiction to the principles of the Islamic resistance movement. There's no solution now for the Palestinian question except through jihad, that is through military action and conquest." So that's what's driving them, that They totally reject a two-state solution. They want to do everything they can to make it impossible. The October the 7th attack is, they wanted to drag Israel back into battle. They are totally convinced that they're going to win. And it's not just Hamas. I think Fatah and the overall track record of the Palestinian movement, going back to the 30s, has been that again and again, opportunities for a two-state solution have been rejected. But Hamas, I think, is perhaps the most blatant and open in its contempt for two-state, so-called peaceful solutions. It says that they believe the only way forward is through conquest. So
it's confronting. It's confronting to those of us, and including you and I, who long for peace. I think it leaves us with the question: how do we deal with Hamas? And we'll pick that up in future podcasts. What's our next topic, Mark? What do you think we should tackle next in trying to wrap our heads around the Middle East?
Well, we could think about the land and the land issues. Why don't we talk about why Hamas thinks they can win? Because when you think about it, to take on a state with an army of 500,000 and nuclear power as well, and to take them on when you've got 10 or 20,000 fighters in an impoverished and depressed region, it seems insane. But that's a really interesting question. Why do they think they can win?
Yeah, and that will be critical in understanding how can we handle Hamas. What do we do with them? We better understand maybe the tactical questions around how they think they're going to go about winning. Thank you for joining us, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for joining our very first Arthur Jeffrey Center podcast. Hope to see you next time.